Hello, everyone, and welcome to Social Sciences with R onboarding for data carpentry instructors. My name is Erin Becker. I'm the Associate Director with the Carpentries, and I will be leading today's onboarding session. This onboarding is primarily intended for people who are already certified Carpentries instructors who are interested in teaching the social sciences lessons using R. It is also useful for trainees who have completed instructor training and are working towards gaining their certification, and also for people who have applied to join the instructor training program and are waiting for their application to be reviewed. Please do note that this 1-hour onboarding session is not a substitute for the 2-day long instructor training course or for any stage of the instructor training checkout process. If you're not a certified instructor, you will need to complete the instructor training course and checkout before teaching at a centrally organized Carpentries workshop. I'll be posting these slides along with the recording, and so you can click on any of the links that are embedded in the slides to get more information about instructor training, instructor checkout process, and other resources as they are shared on the slides. If you're not already a Carpentries instructor, please do stay. This onboarding is also for you. We do want to expand the scope of the audience teaching these lessons to as broad a community as possible. So if you're not a Carpentries certified instructor, you are welcome to use and to adapt these lessons for other teaching contexts. Please check out our license terms for usage conditions. You are also welcome as a non-certified instructor to teach a self-organized Carpentry branded workshop, provided that one of the other instructors at the workshop is a certified instructor. And you can see the requirements for running a Carpentries branded workshop by clicking on that link. If you're already attending this onboarding, you probably have some idea of what the goals are, but this onboarding has 2 specific goals. One is to help prepare you to teach a data carpentry social sciences workshop. The social science workshop is targeted for 2 days of instruction, so we will not be going through all of the material in depth here, but we will help you gain familiarity with the structure and organization of the curriculum, the structure and organization of the data, and to understand where you can get information, where you can get additional resources about solving common problems that learners have when learning these lessons. After completing this onboarding, you will also get priority placement for teaching at centrally organized Carpentries social sciences workshops. You don't need to be an onboarded instructor in order to teach at these workshops, but we will be giving instructors who've gone through this onboarding process priority to teach these workshops. This, of course, only applies to certified instructors teaching at centrally organized workshops. A general note to be clear that this onboarding does not cover 2 of the lessons that are currently in the beta development stage for social sciences. That includes the data analysis and visualization with Python lesson and the data management with SQL lesson. These materials are actually in the alpha development, not beta, and are not currently part of Data Carpentry core curricular offerings. They are available to use and adapt in terms with our license, as are all of our lessons, but they are not well developed enough that at this point they can be used broadly by all Carpentries instructors. So this onboarding will not cover those lessons at this point. To start us out talking about the curriculum itself, this Data Carpentry Social Sciences curriculum was originally a direct copy of the Data Carpentry Ecology curriculum. Many of our instructors have experience teaching the ecology curriculum, so I will make some comparisons as we go through this onboarding and point out where they are similar and different. You don't need to have taught the ecology curriculum in order to teach this lesson, but I do want to point out those analogies for instructors who do have that previous experience. The data set and the exercises that are used in these lessons have all been completely updated to target the new audience that we are expecting to attend the social science workshops. Give you a little bit of an introduction to the data that's used in this lesson. This is a tabular data set that was generated as part of a study called Studying African Farmer-Led Irrigation, or SAFI. This study involved surveys that were conducted using a smartphone application that asked respondents questions about their household, how many members are in their household, how many rooms are in their house, what sort of belongings do they have, and agricultural practices that they used on their farms, whether they used certain types of irrigation, whether they were members of agricultural societies, and I'll showcase that data in just a moment here. Important to note that the data set that's used in this curriculum is actually a subset of a larger study. So only 131 responses are included in the teaching data set. There are about 1,200 responses that are part of the full SAFI data set. I'll take us just to the data description page on the workshop website. So you can see here that there's a lot more information about this data, including the link to Figshare, where the data is published, and citation for the data, some more description about the formatting of the data itself, and then a table describing what question or piece of information is included in each of the column by column name. So if you ever have a question about what exactly is intended by the data that's collected in one column, you can refer back to this metadata table, which is at the Social Science Workshop website in the Data tab. Going back to our slides. Next, I want to give a bit of an overview of the general workshop structure. There are 3 lessons included in this workshop: data organization with spreadsheets, data cleaning with Open or Fine, and data analysis and visualization with R. I do want to note here for any instructors who have experience with the ecology lessons that the data organization and spreadsheets and data cleaning with Open or Fine lessons take longer to teach than their counterparts in the ecology lesson for reasons that I'll talk about shortly. We do anticipate that they take somewhere between 2 and 3 hours each, as opposed to 1.5 to 2 hours for the ecology lessons. Another thing to be clear about upfront with your learners and as you're preparing to teach is that there are multiple different versions of the teaching data set that are used for the different lessons. This is very similar to how things work in the ecology lesson, where we have created different messy versions of the spreadsheet and messy versions of the CSV file to teach the learners particular things and particular strategies for cleaning up the data. And so if you look at the setup page for either the spreadsheet lesson or the Open or Fine lesson, you will see links to all of the relevant data files Here there's 3 versions of the data set that the learners need to download. For Open Refine, there's 1 version of the data set, and for the R lesson, there's also only 1 version of the data set, but the learners will download it using the download.file function call in the first R lesson episode. So I'll show you where that appears in the lesson. There's some introduction of R in RStudio. I'll talk more about this when we get to that lesson. But near the bottom of that first lesson page, the first episode, there's this call to download the SAFI clean data file. So it's important for your learners to have access to all of the appropriate data files and to make sure that they're working with the correct data file for each of the lessons. I'll talk some about the audience that we have had so far for these workshops and that we anticipate. This workshop is intended for researchers that are working with tabular data in the social sciences realm. The focus is on people who work with survey data or interview data. In the pilot workshop so far, we found that about half of the learners have some prior experience using a graphical user interface statistical analysis software such as SPSS or SAS. Some, but not many, of the learners at the workshops have prior experience with R. Many have worked with Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey data, but have not necessarily been successful in formatting the output data from those GUI systems to be able to work with it productively. And that's the motivation that they're coming to the workshop with. So they often have their own survey or interview data set that they have been trying to work with and trying to analyze and have been frustrated with because of formatting issues largely. So do expect your learners to be very detail-oriented, to be very much focused on solving particular problems, and plan for time for questions. This is part of the reason that I've found the first 2 lessons in the series for spreadsheets and Open Refine to have been longer than the lessons in the ecology workshop, because there is a lot of specific questions about formatting that appear to be directed towards the learners' particular projects and data sets that they're working with. And that's great. It's important for the workshop to be useful for the learners, so do plan that time for questions. Also be prepared for a diversity of operating systems and a diversity of different versions of software, particularly with spreadsheet software. Talk about some of the challenges with a variety of software versions for spreadsheet software in just a moment. But do note that if you've taught Carpentry's workshops before, you may see a different distribution of operating systems with a heavier bias towards Windows machines in these workshops. So do plan for that and plan for some additional debugging time and troubleshooting time with data, with software download and software installs. After completing this 2-day workshop, your learners should have a number of skills that will allow them to take their data from the collection and organization point to some simple analyses. They should be able to take their tabular data and organize it properly in a spreadsheet so that they are able to use it in downstream applications. They should have some strategies for handling date formatting. They should know some techniques for carrying out simple quality control and quality assurance with their spreadsheet software. And they should know how to export their data from spreadsheets and use it with downstream applications like OpenRefine and R. They should be able to import their data into R, calculate some simple summary statistics, and create some publication quality, high quality graphics. Moving into the individual lessons, we'll talk about each of these lessons separately. So starting with data organization and spreadsheets. This covers some good data entry practices, how to format the data tables in spreadsheets so that they are useful and are exportable and useful in later applications, downstream applications. Covers how to avoid common formatting mistakes, handling dates, quality control, and exporting data. The number one point to make about this lesson is that it's the first lesson in the workshop. It's really critical to get the motivation, to get your learners motivated about the things that they're going to learn in the workshop. As you know from Carpentry's instructor training, most of our learners come to the workshop already motivated. So the goal is to not demotivate them and to keep them motivated. So we generally start by motivating this lesson by talking about things that spreadsheets are good at versus not good at, what they're going to be learning in this lesson, but to jump pretty quickly into an engagement activity. So there's an exercise at the beginning of this lesson that is about finding problems in a messy spreadsheet. And so the learners are given a really incredibly messy spreadsheet, and they're put in pairs to talk with another learner at the workshop and identify all of the problems that they see with the spreadsheet. This is a great opening activity. It really gets people talking. It gets people laughing because the spreadsheet is really terrible and is intentionally terrible. And so it's a great activity to get them engaged. You can then, as the instructor, use their responses. So they'll type their responses onto the Etherpad or collaborative note-taking document. And you as the instructor can look at those responses and engage the class and explain the issues with the spreadsheet using their responses as a guide. An important thing to note here is that one of the episodes in this lesson, it's called the Formatting Problems episode. It is actually a solution to the first exercise, not an independent teachable episode. So please be aware of that and use it to guide the discussion of the learner's responses to that first exercise, not as a script that you read off to the learners. There is a particular oddity to the way that this data set is formatted that is intentionally and explicitly dealt with in the OpenRefine lesson, which directly follows the spreadsheeting lesson, but can cause trouble for learners who are using LibreOffice to open up the spreadsheet. There are several columns that have lists of items or lists of months within a single cell. Those items are separated by a semicolon. And this can cause import problems because LibreOffice defaults to treating commas, tabs, and semicolons all as separators. So if you have learners who are opening up the spreadsheet and they have many more columns than the other learners in the workshop, it's because of this issue, and you can have them reopen the spreadsheet and unclick the separator box for semicolons when LibreOffice opens. And there are instructions about this also in the instructor notes and at that point in the lesson so that there's guidance around this common issue. I mentioned just briefly before that we do have a kind of wide variety of different spreadsheet software versions that learners use in this lesson. That's also true when teaching the ecology lesson, but it seems to be more true in teaching this lesson. So LibreOffice, I discussed the issue with using semicolons as default separators. There's more information about that issue if you click on this link on the slide. Numbers, which is the default spreadsheet software that comes with Mac operating systems, does not have a data validation function. So we recommend that learners who have Macs either use LibreOffice or use Excel rather than numbers so that they can follow the whole lesson. We've also found some interesting issues with learners who are using non-English language versions of Excel in the workshop. For example, there's a section where learners have to type formula names, month, day, and year. And if a learner has a German version of Excel, they will need to type the German name for month, day, and year. So do be aware of that. I've taught 3 different pilots for the social sciences now, and at every single one of those, there has been someone with a different non-English version of Excel. So that has been a common issue to face as an instructor in the workshops. There's also a very common issue with date handling being different depending on location. So if a learner has a European formatted version of Excel or an American formatted version of Excel, those 2 versions will treat dates differently. There are many details about this in the instructor notes, but the point of all of this is not to list a lot of specific issues, but to remind you to not rush, take the time to troubleshoot with your learners. This is, again, the first lesson in the workshop, and making sure that your learners stay on track and are able to engage in all of the activities is really valuable at this point for their continued engagement throughout the rest of the workshop. It also is very helpful to have a lot of helpers at your workshop so that they can provide one-on-one support for individual learners who are experiencing any sort of technical issue. We'll move on now to talking about the second lesson in the workshop. This is data cleaning with Open or Fine. This lesson tends to get people very, very excited. Open or Fine is not a piece of software that many people have heard about before coming to Carpentry's workshop, and it ends up being kind of life-changing for a lot of the people in the workshop. So they're quite excited about it. So this can also help get some of that motivation and excitement back. This lesson covers faceting, which is a grouping mechanism within Open or Fine to get an overview of the data within a particular column. It covers clustering, which is a useful method for helping to identify errors with data entry. It also covers data transformations using GREL statements, which is not something that the ecology lesson offers and is something that has been very useful for learners. Filtering and sorting data, and exporting scripts and being able to use them for reproducible data cleaning. A couple of troubleshooting tips. One is that for some learners, the first time they try to open or Fine, it may not open simply by clicking on the application icon. If that's the case for a learner, you can have them go to this URL, which you should put into the Etherpad rather than making them type it out. And then they can point their browser at that URL and Open or Fine should open. Every subsequent time that they open it, it should open without having to do this workaround. There's a lot of information about that and other troubleshooting tips in the setup guide, so do take a look at that. I always try to remember to remind my learners at the beginning of the Open or Find lesson that for this lesson in particular, we have set things up so that there's a specific order to how the messiness in the data set is cleaned. And so if they work independently and try out different things with Open or Find on this data set, they will not get the same solutions to the exercises that the rest of the class is getting. So if they want to be able to follow along, it's important that they execute all of the cleaning steps the same way that the instructor in the front of the room is executing the steps. There is an undo redo button that you can show them that will help them if they've gotten off track. A thing to be aware of is that the section on transforming data with GREL statements does get quite technical. It's certainly the most technical part of the workshop that they've seen so far. So do be explicit about the syntax. Just like you learned in instructor training, when you're gonna type a parenthesis, say that you're typing a parenthesis or a bracket or a comma, or if a space matters or doesn't matter. So be very explicit about each point of the syntax. Take time to troubleshoot and to let your learners troubleshoot. Making errors and learning from them is one of the most important parts of the learning process. And you can also demonstrate using history. So in the GREL window, I'll scroll down to the part in the lesson that deals with this here. So here we have the GREL statement interface. The solutions to the exercises in some cases are quite similar, and so they can use the history section of the GREL window interface to redo some of their recent exercise solutions and modify them for the current exercise. If needed for time constraints, you can skip the sections that are labeled examining numbers and other resources. This is nothing in later lessons is dependent on those two parts of the lesson, so they are safe to skip. I'll move on now to talking about the third and final lesson that's included in this curriculum, the data analysis and visualization with R lesson. This uses the dplyr, tidyr, readr, and ggplot2 packages, all of which are installed through loading tidyverse. I'll just make a caveat that if you are familiar with R and you don't already use these 4 specific R packages, you can still teach this lesson. If you know about R and you know about how packages work, you can teach yourself these lessons using the Carpentry materials, and they will be relatively intuitive to you if you're familiar with package architecture. Point being that you don't have to be an expert in these particular packages in order to be an effective Carpentries instructor. So do take time to look at the lessons and see if there's something you'd like to teach. This particular lesson covers how to install packages, how to seek help and get answers to your troubleshooting questions. It covers basic data structures within R with a focus on vectors and data frames as opposed to lists. Data import and export. It covers subsetting using both the base R syntax and the dplyr package. Data type conversions, handling missing data, which is something that has been very important for the audiences I've worked with. Date formatting again, data reshaping with gather and spread, which is again, I was surprised to learn that everybody really wanted to know how to reshape their data. So that's a very valuable part of the lesson for this audience, and ending with data visualization. A couple things to keep in mind if you use R and are teaching this lesson does use a project setup. So if you haven't used the project setup in R before, please check that out before teaching this lesson. It helps learners not have to worry about things like setting their file paths and setting their directory paths. So this is makes things a little bit easier for the learners, because that's not a topic that we spend a lot of time on or any time on in this workshop. The R lesson starts out with discussing variable assignment and builds up to working with larger data structures, including data frames. So it can be quite slow, making that build up from single variables to larger data structures. It can take 2 or even 3 hours before the learners are working with the SAFI tabular data set. So it's important to keep them motivated during that time. Try to keep the examples relevant and remind them of what's coming. And that can be something that is a little bit difficult to keep that motivation going, but it's something to be aware of. And a last point here is that the gather and spread section is not skippable in the current version of this lesson. It is needed for creating the data structure that is used in plotting. So I bring that up because in the ecology lesson, you can skip the gather and spread section, but here it's essential to teach that section. So be aware of that for time constraints. The visualization lesson, which is the last part of the R lesson, includes several different geoms. So it covers geom point, geom jitter, geom box plot, and geom bar. It does also cover facet wrap, as well as themes and customization. And I want to show you an example of the progression of visualization in this lesson. This is the first plot that the learners will create. It's a very uninformative scatter plot of the number of members in a household and the number of distinct items in a particular list that the respondents said that their household owned. So it's not a very informative or pretty graph. And at the end of the visualization section, the learners should be able to create this graphic, which gives the percentage of respondents in each of 3 villages who said that they owned each particular object in the list. And if you are not familiar with British English, a lorry is a truck, and a torch is a flashlight for American audiences. So that's something to be aware of as well if you're teaching this with a different dialect set. So this is a much more publishable, much more flashy version of the visualization, and this is what your learners build up to over the course of that lesson. A couple of things to watch out for. I already mentioned the dependencies between the episodes, that you do need to do the reshaping section in order to teach the visualization episode. We talked about demotivation and burnout. If learners get demotivated by the fact that they're not currently working with the real data, so they'll see the real data in the spreadsheets lesson, and they'll see it in the open refine lesson, and they'll work with it a little bit in the open refine lesson. But then at the beginning of the R lesson, you go back to simple variable assignment, and it takes a while to get back into the real data, so that can lead to some burnout. It's important to keep that in mind while you're working with your learners. And lastly, but not least, is the issue of rushing. So it's always better for your learners to learn something than for you to say everything that's included in the lesson. So try to pace things according to what your learners need and make it an experience that's targeted towards your audience. So that concludes the topic of the content for this lesson. I will spend just a couple of minutes here wrapping up about resources and preparing to teach this curriculum. So if you're planning on teaching a social sciences curriculum, please, the first step that I always take is to read the instructor notes for the lessons that you're teaching. So you can access these here through these links, and also access them through the main page of the lessons page. So this includes information for instructors that talks about the data set and how to access the data set, talks about installing RStudio and R, and then gives some information about each of the individual sections of the lesson, each of the episodes. So it talks about the main points of each episode and some things that you should watch out for in terms of what will be familiar to the learners from previous lessons, what won't be familiar to them, and what are some things that you might need to spend extra time on or explain carefully and be aware of. There's also some technical tips and tricks that will be useful to you in helping your learners troubleshoot, and additional place for instructors to put other resources that you found to be useful in preparing to teach this lesson. So the instructor notes are a good place to start. The second thing that I would do is read through the materials that you are planning on teaching and test out every single line of code. If you're someone who's familiar with the pieces of software that you're going to be teaching and use them a lot in your own daily work, you might not think about the importance of explicitly testing out each single line of code that you're going to be teaching. But please do be aware that even a minor change in syntax or a minor difference in your system setup from what your learner system setup is can cause differences in the way that the code behaves on your machine, which then can cause a cognitive overload for the learners, because you're going to have to explain why it didn't work the way you expected it to, what it should have been doing, and it's just always good to test out every single line of code and make sure it behaves the way you expect it to behave. If you have general questions about teaching Carpentry's workshops, please consider joining an instructor discussion session. You can find that information by clicking on that link. This is a good opportunity to talk to seasoned Carpentry's instructors as well as new instructors and exchange tips and tricks for teaching. And there, it's also a good place to ask people for their strategies on how to prepare to teach. So congratulations, you now have priority when signing up to teach social science workshops. Please make sure that you are on the instructor mailing list. You can sign up here to hear about upcoming teaching opportunities. If you don't want to wait for a new teaching opportunity to come along, you can organize a beta pilot workshop at your institution. There's some information about how to organize that at that link there. And please do recognize that these lessons are still in active development. Please leave feedback for the lesson developers and the other instructors via issues and pull requests to the lesson repositories. If that's not something that you're familiar with and you're not necessarily comfortable doing that, we do have some instructions here for how to leave feedback, and we do pride ourselves on always trying to be a very open and friendly community, so please don't feel like any suggestions or questions are stupid or misguided. But if you prefer to send feedback or questions by email, I'll show an email address in just a moment here where you can direct those inquiries. I talked already about the instructor notes. I also want to point out that if you have questions about these lessons specifically, you can also contact the DC Social Sci Slack channel. There's a link there on how to join that channel. If you have broader discussions of the lessons that you want to engage in, you can email the social sciences curriculum list to talk about whether that's developing new lessons or changing the lessons substantially. That's the place to go with questions about that. And if you have general questions about workshops or teaching, you can contact team@carpentrys.org. Please also, if you're finishing listening to this onboarding video, please do send a an email to team@carpentries.org to let us know that you've completed this onboarding so we can make a note on your instructor profile and prioritize you for future teaching opportunities. So that's all the information I have. I will post these slides as well so that you can have access to those links. And I really look forward to having you as a member of the Carpentry Social Sciences community.